Have you ever stopped for a moment and asked yourself something strange, something almost uncomfortable once you truly begin thinking about it? Why did the Neanderthals disappear while we're the only human species left alive today? Because a lot of people hear the word Neanderthal and immediately imagine some kind of primitive beast or ape-like creature wandering through caves with no intelligence and no real humanity. But that image is completely wrong, because Neanderthals were actually another type of human living beside us tens of thousands of years ago, and not only were they human, but in many ways they may have been stronger than us, more adapted to brutal environments than us, and possibly even more physically capable than modern humans could ever hope to become. And here is where the mystery begins to feel deeply unsettling once you truly understand what the Neanderthals actually were. Because these were not weak creatures waiting helplessly for extinction to arrive, but people who survived one of the harshest worlds human beings have ever faced. People whose bodies were built like survival machines for the Ice Age, with thicker bones, heavier muscles, larger lungs, and a pain tolerance that would probably seem almost inhuman to us today. And yet despite all of that strength, despite surviving for hundreds of thousands of years through freezing climates, predators, starvation, and endless environmental disasters, they vanished completely from the Earth, while somehow our species continued forward alone. And the strangest part of all is that the more archaeology discovers about the Neanderthals, the harder it becomes to explain why they disappeared in the first place. Because for decades, scientists imagined them as unintelligent cavemen incapable of innovation or culture, only for discovery after discovery to completely destroy that theory, revealing instead that Neanderthals made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, hunted massive Ice Age animals at terrifyingly close distances, cared for injured members of their groups for years, buried their dead with what appears to be ritual behavior, and survived Europe long before modern humans ever arrived there. Which raises a deeply uncomfortable question once you fully absorb it. Because if they were truly this intelligent and this capable, then what exactly happened that caused an entire human species to vanish while ours survived? And what makes this mystery even stranger is that Neanderthals were not some distant evolutionary experiment separated from us by millions of years, because genetically they were astonishingly close to modern humans. So close that if you cleaned a Neanderthal, dressed them in modern clothing, and taught them your language, most people today would probably just assume they looked slightly unusual, rather than believing they belonged to another human species entirely. Which means this story is not about monsters disappearing from the Earth, but about another humanity, another version of human existence that walked beside us for thousands of years before fading away forever. But maybe the most disturbing part of this entire mystery is the realization that Neanderthals did not disappear immediately after modern humans arrived in Europe, because for thousands of years both species existed side by side across the same landscapes, hunting the same animals, surviving the same winters, drinking from the same rivers, and looking up at the same night sky, which means there were moments deep in the Ice Age when two different kinds of humans saw each other face to face across fires and forests and frozen valleys, and that alone raises endless questions that scientists still cannot fully answer. Because what did they think when they first encountered one another? Did they feel fear, curiosity, hatred, confusion, recognition, or something even stranger than all of those emotions combined? And what makes those encounters even more haunting is the fact that they clearly did not always end in violence, because modern humans today still carry Neanderthal DNA inside their bodies, which means that somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens not only met, but trusted each other enough to create families together. And once you realize that, the entire story changes from a simple extinction narrative into something far more emotional and unsettling, because now the question is no longer just why did the Neanderthals die, but also how could a human species so close to us disappear while traces of them still survive inside our own blood? And to truly understand what happened, we need to go back into the Ice Age itself, because most people imagine prehistoric Europe as a simple frozen wasteland covered endlessly in snow, when in reality it was a world of terrifying instability where temperatures shifted violently over generations, forests appeared and disappeared, rivers changed course, prey animals migrated unpredictably, and entire ecosystems transformed fast enough that a human group could spend decades mastering one environment only to suddenly find themselves trapped inside a completely different one. And the reason this matters so much is because survival in prehistoric Europe was not just about strength, but about adaptability, flexibility, communication, memory, and the ability to survive constant environmental chaos without collapsing under the pressure. And this is where scientists begin to notice something extremely important about the difference between Neanderthals and modern humans. Because while Neanderthals were physically powerful and incredibly resilient, they also seem to have lived in very small, isolated populations spread across enormous territories, which may not sound dangerous at first until you begin imagining what that actually means in a brutal Ice Age world. Because a single bad winter, a failed migration, a deadly infection, or the loss of a few experienced hunters could suddenly push an already tiny group dangerously close to extinction. And once populations become too small, something terrifying begins happening slowly and silently in the background, because genetic diversity shrinks, diseases become more destructive, knowledge spreads more slowly, and entire bloodlines can disappear forever from a single environmental disaster. And perhaps the most fascinating question of all is whether the Neanderthals actually lost to modern humans because Homo sapiens were smarter individually, or whether something much larger and more invisible was happening beneath the surface of the Ice Age world, because recent discoveries suggest that the real advantage of modern humans may not have been physical strength or even intelligence alone, but social networks, larger connections between groups, broader trade systems, faster sharing of information, and stronger long-distance cooperation. Meaning that while Neanderthals may have survived as isolated bands fighting against nature almost entirely on their own, Homo sapiens were slowly becoming something else entirely. A species capable of connecting knowledge across enormous distances in ways no human species had ever done before. And once you begin looking at the story from that perspective, the disappearance of the Neanderthal starts becoming far more unsettling than a simple war between two species, because now it begins looking like the story of two different survival strategies competing against the same brutal world. One built on physical adaptation to the environment itself, and the other built on social complexity, communication, cooperation, and the ability to spread ideas faster than climate and disaster could destroy them, which raises another terrifying possibility hidden underneath the entire mystery. Because what if the Neanderthals did not disappear because they were weak, but because the world itself was changing into something their way of life could no longer survive? Imagine Europe around 60,000 years ago not as a continent of nations and borders and crowded cities glowing beneath electric lights, but as a vast unpredictable wilderness stretching endlessly beneath cold skies where survival depended entirely on your ability to understand the land more intimately than modern humans can even imagine, because there were no roads to follow, no maps to trust, no permanent settlements waiting beyond the horizon, only forests, rivers, glaciers, open grasslands, and long winters capable of killing entire groups if even a few small decisions went wrong, and moving through that world was the Neanderthal, a human species that had already survived there for hundreds of thousands of years before our ancestors ever arrived from Africa. And what makes the Neanderthals extraordinary is not simply that they survived the Ice Age, but that they survived environments so violent and unstable that many scientists now believe modern industrial civilization itself would struggle to adapt if those same climate shifts happened today. Because Ice Age Europe was not one endless frozen winter the way people often imagine, but a world constantly swinging between periods of relative warmth and brutal cold, where forests could expand across enormous regions only to collapse again generations later beneath advancing ice and falling temperatures, meaning that animals migrated unpredictably, plant life changed constantly, rivers shifted course, and entire ecosystems transformed fast enough that human groups had to continuously adapt or disappear. And this is important because when most people think about extinction, they imagine a dramatic, catastrophic ending, some final disaster or violent war that wipes everything out all at once. But real extinction is often slower and crueler than that, because it usually begins quietly in ways almost impossible to notice at first, with slightly fewer successful hunts, slightly harsher winters, slightly fewer births, slightly more children dying young, slightly more isolation between neighbouring groups, until eventually the population becomes so fragile that even ordinary bad luck starts becoming deadly. And bad luck in the Paleolithic world was everywhere, because every single aspect of survival depended on fragile chains of events remaining stable long enough for your group to endure another season, which meant that if the reindeer migration arrived late, or if disease spread through the camp during winter, or if 2 experienced hunters died within the same year, or if a severe storm trapped your people away from familiar shelter, the consequences could ripple outward for generations, especially if your population was already dangerously small to begin with. And evidence increasingly suggests that Neanderthal populations really were extremely small compared to the expanding populations of Homo sapiens moving gradually into Europe, because genetic analysis of Neanderthal remains reveals something deeply unsettling once scientists began sequencing their DNA, which is that many Neanderthal groups appear to have lived in levels of isolation that modern humans would find almost impossible to comprehend, with some populations potentially numbering only a few dozen interconnected individuals across enormous regions, meaning that entire family lines could vanish permanently from a single failed generation. And once you begin imagining life inside one of those tiny Ice Age groups, the emotional reality of Neanderthal existence starts becoming much clearer, because you're no longer thinking about humanity as billions of strangers spread across continents, but as perhaps 20 or 30 individuals who know each other so intimately that every death permanently changes the structure of the group itself. Because the loss of one experienced tracker does not simply remove another person from the camp, it removes years of accumulated landscape knowledge, migration memory, hunting skill, and survival experience that may never be replaced again. And perhaps this is one reason archaeologists now see Neanderthals less as brutish cavemen and more as intensely social human beings whose survival depended entirely on cooperation, because some of the strongest evidence for Neanderthal humanity comes not from their weapons or tools, but from the individuals they kept alive despite devastating injuries that should have made survival impossible in the Ice Age world, including skeletons of Neanderthals who survived for years with crushed limbs, severe infections, blindness, missing teeth, and injuries that would have prevented them from hunting entirely, which means someone else had to feed them, protect them, and care for them long after they stopped being physically useful to the group. And that realization changes something important in the story, because once you understand that Neanderthals cared for vulnerable members of their communities, the mystery of their extinction becomes emotionally heavier, since we're no longer talking about animals disappearing from nature, but about another kind of humanity capable of empathy, attachment, grief, memory, and emotional bonds strong enough to sustain injured individuals for years in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But then another question begins emerging from the archaeological evidence, one that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the deeper scientists study the overlap between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Because if Neanderthals were strong enough to survive Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years and emotionally intelligent enough to maintain complex social bonds, then why did their populations begin collapsing only after modern humans arrived in significant numbers? And this is where the story becomes deeply fascinating, because the answer may have less to do with violence and more to do with something far more invisible and powerful, something modern humans still depend on today without realizing it, which is networks. Because one of the greatest advantages Homo sapiens appear to have possessed was not necessarily individual superiority, but the ability to maintain much larger social connections across enormous distances, allowing information, tools, ideas, and survival strategies to spread rapidly between groups before environmental disaster could wipe them out. And archaeologists see evidence of this everywhere once modern humans begin appearing across Europe, because suddenly objects start travelling astonishing distances through prehistoric trade systems, including shells transported hundreds of miles inland, rare stone materials moving between distant populations, pigments traded across regions, and tool designs spreading rapidly from one community to another, all suggesting that Homo sapiens were becoming part of enormous interconnected social worlds, while Neanderthal groups remained far more isolated from one another. And at first this difference may not seem important until you truly think about what information means in a dangerous prehistoric environment. Because imagine one human group discovers a more efficient hunting technique, warmer clothing design, better spear technology, safer migration route, or more reliable seasonal food source. And now imagine that information spreading outward across dozens of connected bands before winter arrives, because suddenly survival is no longer limited to what your own group personally discovers through trial and error, but expands through the collective knowledge of hundreds or even thousands of humans connected through trade, marriage, storytelling, and movement across the landscape. Meanwhile, isolated Neanderthal populations may have depended far more heavily on local memory alone, meaning that when disaster struck, adaptation happened more slowly, and knowledge disappeared more easily whenever groups died out or became separated from one another. And if this theory is correct, then the disappearance of the Neanderthals may represent one of the most important turning points in human history, because it may mark the moment when social complexity itself became humanity's greatest survival weapon, stronger than muscles, stronger than cold adaptation, stronger even than individual intelligence, since the species capable of sharing information fastest eventually became the species capable of surviving almost anywhere. But even that may not fully explain what happened, because another terrifying possibility exists hidden beneath the archaeological evidence, one scientists still debate intensely today, which is that modern humans may not have intentionally destroyed the Neanderthals at all, but instead simply consumed the same resources more efficiently while reproducing faster, gradually overwhelming Neanderthal populations through demographic pressure alone, until there were simply too many Homo sapiens competing across Europe for Neanderthal communities to recover from repeated environmental stress. And this creates an image of extinction that feels disturbingly modern once you think about it carefully. Because rather than dramatic conquest, the Neanderthals may have disappeared through slow displacement, through shrinking territories, dwindling resources, collapsing populations, and increasing isolation, while modern human populations expanded around them, generation after generation like rising water, slowly swallowing islands. And perhaps the saddest part of all is that the Neanderthals themselves may never have understood what was happening, because extinction viewed from inside rarely feels like the end of the world, but instead feels like ordinary life continuing under worsening pressure. Another harsh winter, another failed hunt, another missing neighbouring group that never returns to the valley again, another year where fewer children survive than before, until eventually the silence spreading across the landscape becomes impossible to ignore. And somewhere inside that growing silence, inside those increasingly empty valleys and abandoned caves scattered across Ice Age Europe, another question begins haunting the entire story once you truly allow yourself to think about it carefully. Because what if the Neanderthals were not simply losing a competition for survival, but were instead facing a world that was transforming faster than any human species before them had ever experienced? Since one of the most terrifying realities of the late Ice Age is that climate itself had become unstable, in ways capable of reshaping entire ecosystems within only a few generations, meaning that a child born into one environment could grow old inside a completely different world from the one their grandparents understood. And modern humans arriving from Africa did not enter Europe during a calm or stable period, but during one of the most environmentally chaotic phases of prehistoric history, when temperatures repeatedly crashed and recovered across enormous regions with shocking speed, causing forests to vanish, grasslands to expand, animal migrations to shift unpredictably, and food systems to collapse faster than many isolated human populations could adapt. Which matters because Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving bodies and hunting strategies specifically adapted to particular kinds of environments and prey animals, especially large Ice Age mammals that provided enormous amounts of calories necessary to sustain their physically demanding bodies. And this is one of the most important differences scientists now discuss when comparing Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, because Neanderthals appear to have relied much more heavily on large game hunting than modern humans did, with evidence suggesting diets centered around animals like mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, and giant deer, which worked extremely well as long as those ecosystems remained stable enough to support predictable migrations and large prey populations, but became increasingly dangerous once climate instability began disrupting those systems repeatedly across Europe. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens appear to have behaved more like ecological opportunists, capable of surviving through far more flexible food strategies, including fishing, trapping small animals, gathering a broader range of plant foods, exploiting coastal resources, and adapting more rapidly to changing environments. Which may not sound dramatic at first, until you realize that flexibility during environmental collapse can become more important than raw physical power, because in survival terms, the strongest species is not always the one that dominates stable conditions, but the one capable of adapting fastest once conditions stop remaining predictable. And perhaps nowhere is this difference more visible than in the tools left behind by both species, because while Neanderthal technology was sophisticated and highly effective for close-range hunting in dangerous Ice Age environments, Homo sapiens gradually developed tool systems that appear increasingly specialized, varied, and adaptable across different ecological conditions, including lighter projectile weapons, complex bone tools, advanced needles for fitted clothing, fishing equipment, traps, and broader experimentation with materials, all suggesting a species rapidly expanding its behavioral flexibility, while Neanderthals remained comparatively tied to older survival patterns that had worked successfully for hundreds of thousands of years before the environment itself began destabilizing. But here the story becomes even more unsettling, because some scientists now believe the Neanderthals may actually have been trapped by their own success, since they had survived Europe for so long and adapted so effectively to specific Ice Age conditions that their survival systems became highly specialized toward worlds that no longer fully existed by the final stage of their history. While Homo sapiens arriving from Africa may have possessed an evolutionary advantage precisely because they were newer to those environments, and therefore behaviorally more experimental and flexible. And once you begin thinking about extinction this way, it stops looking like a simple battle between stronger and weaker humans, and starts looking more like two different philosophies of survival, colliding against environmental chaos. Because Neanderthals appear to represent a deeply specialized form of human adaptation, refined across hundreds of thousands of years for harsh Eurasian climates, while Homo sapiens increasingly behaved like a species whose greatest strength was not adaptation to one environment, but adaptation to change itself. And perhaps this is why the archaeological record becomes so emotionally strange near the end of Neanderthal history, because instead of evidence for one sudden catastrophic collapse, scientists see patterns suggesting shrinking territories, fragmented populations, isolated communities, and increasingly sparse traces of Neanderthal occupation spread thinly across Europe, until eventually they disappear region by region like lights going out one at a time across a darkening landscape. And if you imagine yourself inside that world, the emotional weight of it becomes difficult to ignore, because there would be no moment where anyone announces that your species is dying, no final understanding that history itself is ending around you, only subtle changes accumulating slowly over generations, fewer neighboring groups arriving during seasonal gatherings, familiar migration routes failing more often, old hunting territories becoming unreliable, stories about distant regions growing quieter because nobody has travelled there in years, until eventually entire valleys fall silent where fires once burned every winter. And then there is the question of children, because ultimately extinction is not really about death, but about birth, since species disappear not when adults die, but when too few children survive long enough to replace them. And this may have been one of the most devastating vulnerabilities facing late Neanderthal populations, because small isolated groups living under increasing environmental stress tend to experience declining fertility, rising infant mortality, dangerous inbreeding effects, and shrinking genetic diversity all at once, creating a terrifying biological spiral where each generation becomes less capable of recovering from disaster than the one before it. And genetic evidence suggests exactly this kind of pressure may have been affecting Neanderthals near the end of their existence, because some Neanderthal genomes reveal strikingly low genetic diversity compared to modern humans, with signs of repeated population bottlenecks and long periods of isolation, meaning that by the time Homo sapiens populations expanded across Europe, many Neanderthal communities may already have been biologically fragile in ways invisible from the outside. But then another possibility emerges from the evidence, one that changes the emotional meaning of Neanderthal extinction entirely. Because what if part of the reason Neanderthals disappeared is that they did not completely disappear at all? Because modern humans today still carry Neanderthal DNA right now, inside your body. And that fact changes everything once you fully understand what it means. Because DNA does not survive through war or conquest alone, but through reproduction, through intimacy, through families, meaning that somewhere during those thousands of years of coexistence, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were not merely competing against one another, but living together closely enough to produce children whose descendants still exist tens of thousands of years later. And suddenly, extinction becomes emotionally complicated in a way most people never consider, because instead of imagining the Neanderthals ending in one final catastrophic moment, we begin imagining something slower and stranger. Small Neanderthal groups gradually merging into expanding Homo sapiens populations, generation after generation, until eventually there were no fully isolated Neanderthal populations left anywhere on Earth. Not extermination, absorption, a humanity dissolving slowly into another humanity. And maybe the last Neanderthal never even knew they were the last, because perhaps there was never one final pure Neanderthal tribe standing dramatically against extinction beneath a frozen sky, but instead countless mixed communities where identities blurred over generations until eventually the distinction itself disappeared forever. And that possibility feels haunting once you sit with it long enough, because it means the Neanderthals may not have vanished through one single tragedy, but through a combination of pressures so complex that no individual could ever fully perceive them while living through them, including climate instability, shrinking populations, interbreeding, competition, disease, isolation, and simple bad luck, all interacting slowly across thousands of years, until eventually only one recognizable human species remained visible in the archaeological record. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is that none of this makes the Neanderthals failures, because surviving for more than 300,000 years in Ice Age Eurasia is not failure by any standard humans should ever use, especially when you realize that Homo sapiens as a species have not even existed that long yet, meaning Neanderthals endured brutal climates, predators, environmental collapse, and countless disasters for an amount of time so vast that modern civilization itself looks microscopic beside it. And maybe that is why their disappearance continues haunting scientists and ordinary people alike, because deep down the story forces us to confront something profoundly uncomfortable about human existence itself, which is that intelligence alone does not guarantee survival, strength alone does not guarantee survival, even humanity itself does not guarantee survival, because entire human worlds can disappear quietly while believing they are permanent right up until the moment history moves beyond them. And perhaps that is the real reason the Neanderthals fascinate us so deeply today, because when we look at them, we're not simply looking at another extinct species, but at another possible version of ourselves, another humanity that laughed beside fires, held children close during winter nights, buried their dead, watched the stars, feared hunger, loved one another, and believed tomorrow would come just as we do now, never realizing that one day they would survive only as fragments hidden silently inside, the DNA of strangers living tens of thousands of years in the future. And maybe the strangest thing of all is that for most of human history, we did not even know the Neanderthals had ever existed, because by the time civilization emerged and cities began rising across the earth, the memory of this other humanity had already vanished so completely that no written language, myth, or surviving tradition clearly remembered them anymore, meaning that for thousands of years modern humans walked across Europe carrying Neanderthal DNA inside their bodies, while having absolutely no idea another human species had once lived, hunted, suffered, and disappeared across those same landscapes. And then in the 19th century something extraordinary happened, because deep inside a limestone valley in Germany known as the Neander Valley, workers quarrying stone uncovered strange ancient bones that looked disturbingly human, and yet somehow different at the same time, with thick, heavy brows, unusually dense bones, and proportions unlike modern Europeans, and at first nobody understood what they had found, because the idea that another human species once existed sounded almost impossible in a world where many people still believed humanity itself had remained unchanged since the beginning of creation. And what makes this discovery even more fascinating is that scientists initially rejected the truth entirely, because some claim the skeleton belonged to a diseased modern human, others insisted it came from a deformed soldier, while many simply refused to accept that another form of humanity had once shared the earth with us, since the idea itself was psychologically disturbing in ways people struggle to process. Because if another human species existed before us and disappeared, then humanity suddenly stopped feeling unique and permanent. But over time, more bones appeared, in caves, river valleys, mountain shelters, ancient camps buried beneath layers of earth and ice, and slowly the evidence became impossible to ignore. A different humanity had once lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before vanishing forever. And once scientists accepted that reality, another even stranger realization followed behind it. Because the more we uncovered about Neanderthals, the more human they started becoming. At first, researchers imagined them as primitive evolutionary failures incapable of culture or intelligence. But each decade shattered another assumption, because archaeologists discovered carefully crafted tools shaped with remarkable precision, evidence of controlled fire use, signs of organized hunting strategies, traces of pigments and ornaments, possible cave art, ritual burials, and skeletons showing years of survival after devastating injuries that would have required long-term social care. And suddenly, the line separating them from us started collapsing. Because what exactly makes someone human once another species is capable of empathy, planning, symbolism, cooperation, and emotional attachment? That question still unsettles scientists today, especially once genetic evidence entered the story. Because for decades nobody knew whether Neanderthals and Homo sapiens merely coexisted, or whether they actually reproduced together. And then in 2010, scientists successfully sequenced large portions of the Neanderthal genome and discovered something astonishing, which is that nearly every modern human outside Africa carries Neanderthal DNA, inherited from ancient interbreeding events tens of thousands of years ago. And this changes the emotional tone of the entire mystery completely, because extinction suddenly stops feeling distant and abstract once you realize the Neanderthals are not entirely gone, since fragments of them still survive biologically inside billions of modern humans alive right now, inside immune systems, inside skin biology, inside metabolism, inside tiny genetic variations inherited across unimaginable stretches of time, which means the Ice Age encounters between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were not isolated accidents, but meaningful enough to permanently shape the future genetic history of our species. And once you fully absorb that reality, another deeply uncomfortable question begins emerging from the story. Because if Neanderthals were human enough to love, reproduce, cooperate, mourn, and survive beside us, then how should we emotionally understand their disappearance at all? Was it extinction, or was it transformation? Because there is something profoundly haunting about the possibility that the Neanderthals did not vanish through one final catastrophic event, but instead dissolved slowly into expanding Homo sapiens populations, until eventually their distinct identity disappeared even while parts of them survived genetically inside us. And maybe this is why so many people feel strangely emotional when learning about Neanderthals, even if they cannot fully explain why. Because somewhere deep inside the human mind there is something unsettling about realizing we were not always alone, that another kind of human once looked at the same moon, watched the same fires, feared the same predators, and then quietly disappeared while our own lineage continued forward, carrying pieces of them into the future. But the deeper scientists investigate Neanderthal extinction, the more another terrifying realization starts becoming unavoidable, because their disappearance may also reveal something dangerous about humanity itself, which is that survival does not necessarily belong to the strongest or even the most intelligent individuals, but often to the species most capable of adapting socially to rapid change. And if that is true, then the Neanderthal story stops being merely ancient history and starts becoming a warning. Because for most of their existence, the Neanderthals were extraordinarily successful. They survived Ice Age Europe longer than modern civilization has existed. They endured environmental disasters that would devastate modern nations. They adapted to brutal climates with astonishing resilience. And yet even they eventually reached limits beyond which adaptation became impossible. Which raises an uncomfortable question for us now. Could the same thing happen to modern humans? Because when scientists study the final phase of Neanderthal existence, they repeatedly see patterns that feel disturbingly familiar to the modern world, including climate instability, shrinking ecosystems, resource competition, fragmented populations, disease pressure, and rapidly changing environments creating stress faster than social systems can comfortably absorb. And maybe this is why the Neanderthal story continues haunting modern imagination so powerfully, because deep down it forces us to confront the reality that extinction is not always dramatic enough to notice while it is happening, since entire worlds can disappear slowly beneath ordinary daily life, while the individuals living through those changes still wake each morning believing tomorrow will mostly resemble yesterday. Imagine being among the final generations of Neanderthals somewhere in Europe around 40,000 years ago, waking beside the fire inside a familiar cave while snow drifts silently across the landscape outside, unaware that your species has already become dangerously rare across the continent, because from your perspective life still feels normal enough. There are still hunts, children, stories, injuries, laughter, arguments, changing seasons, and the endless practical work of survival, filling each day exactly as it always has. And yet beyond your awareness, something irreversible is unfolding across thousands of miles. Neighboring groups are disappearing, trade connections are weakening, birth rates are falling, modern human populations are spreading, climate patterns are destabilizing ecosystems, genetic diversity is shrinking, and no single individual can fully perceive the scale of what is happening, because extinction viewed from inside does not feel like the end of history, but simply like life becoming gradually harder, generation after generation, until eventually recovery is no longer possible. And perhaps the saddest part is that the Neanderthals likely never understood how extraordinary they truly were, because they could not know that tens of thousands of years later, another species of human descended partly from them would uncover their bones buried beneath stone and ice, and spend centuries trying to reconstruct their lives from fragments left behind in caves and sediments. They could not know that future humans would stare into reconstructed Neanderthal eyes inside museums and feel an almost unbearable sense of recognition. They could not know that one day scientists would extract ancient DNA from their bones and discover traces of them still alive inside modern people, walking through cities they could never imagine. And maybe if the Neanderthals could see us now, They'd not recognize our technology, or our civilizations, or the strange glowing worlds we've built around ourselves, but they would probably still recognize something much deeper and older underneath all of it. Because beneath modern language and culture and machines, human beings are still creatures built around fires, around stories, around social bonds, around fear of death, around curiosity about the night sky, around the same emotional instincts that once held small Ice Age groups together against the cold. And perhaps that is the final irony hidden inside the extinction of the Neanderthals, because although their species disappeared, much of what made them human never truly vanished at all, since pieces of their biology survive inside us, while the emotional world they inhabited remains astonishingly recognizable even now, tens of thousands of years later, because they loved, they feared, they protected children, they mourned the dead, they survived brutal winters together, they searched for meaning inside dangerous worlds, and in the end, maybe the reason their disappearance feels so haunting is because when we study the Neanderthals long enough, the boundary between them and us begins dissolving until the story no longer feels like the extinction of strangers, but like the fading of forgotten relatives whose blood and memories still echo faintly inside humanity today. And once you begin seeing the Neanderthals not as primitive creatures, but as another form of humanity standing beside us in the darkness of the Ice Age, another unsettling realization slowly starts emerging from the story, because the extinction of the Neanderthals may also reveal something deeply important about what it actually means to be human in the first place, since for a very long time people assumed intelligence alone separated modern humans from every other species that ever existed, but the Neanderthals complicate that comforting idea enormously, because they were intelligent too, emotional too, social too, and yet despite all of that, they still disappeared while Homo sapiens continued forward alone. And maybe this is why scientists continue arguing so intensely about what truly gave modern humans the final advantage, because the answer becomes strangely difficult to define once you realize the difference was probably not raw intelligence in the traditional sense, since Neanderthals possessed large brains, complex tools, coordinated hunting strategies, emotional bonds, and survival skills refined across hundreds of thousands of years, meaning the crucial difference may have existed somewhere else entirely, hidden not inside individual minds but inside the structure of human cooperation itself. Because one theory becoming increasingly influential among anthropologists suggests that Homo sapiens may have possessed unusually large and flexible social networks, capable of connecting strangers across enormous distances through shared symbols, language, trade, stories, rituals, and cultural identity, allowing information to travel faster and farther than ever before in human history. While Neanderthal communities appear to have remained comparatively small and localized even at the height of their existence. And this difference may sound abstract until you imagine how survival actually worked in the Ice Age world. Because when disaster struck one isolated Neanderthal group, there may have been nobody nearby capable of helping them recover. No large alliance network sending resources or exchanging knowledge. No distant population connected strongly enough to stabilize the collapse, whereas Homo sapiens communities increasingly behaved like enormous webs of cooperation spreading across continents, meaning that knowledge, innovations, resources and social support could survive even if individual groups disappeared. And perhaps this was the real evolutionary revolution that changed human history forever. Not sharper spears or stronger muscles or even larger brains, but the emergence of humans capable of imagining themselves as part of much larger social realities extending far beyond immediate family or local territory. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because modern civilization itself still operates according to that exact principle today. Almost nothing surrounding your life right now exists because of one isolated individual acting alone. Your food, your electricity, your technology, your medicine, your language, your culture. All of it depends on vast invisible networks of cooperation linking millions of strangers together through shared systems of trust, communication, and symbolic meaning, which means the same social abilities that may once have helped Homo sapiens outcompete Neanderthals eventually became the foundation for civilization itself. But here another haunting possibility appears beneath the surface of the story, because if Homo sapiens truly survived partly because of superior social complexity, then the extinction of the Neanderthals may also mark the moment when humanity became permanently separated from the natural rhythms that had governed every earlier human species before us. Because Neanderthals lived entirely inside nature, not observing it from a distance, not controlling it through machines, living inside it. Every sound mattered, every weather shift mattered, every migration mattered, every season mattered. Their survival depended on direct, intimate awareness of the environment around them in ways modern humans rarely experience anymore. And perhaps this is one reason so many people feel strangely drawn toward prehistoric life, despite all its danger and hardship. Because deep down, many modern humans still carry nervous systems shaped by hundreds of thousands of years spent living close to landscapes, firelight, weather, animals, darkness, and small, tightly bonded communities. Which means part of the emotional fascination surrounding Neanderthals may actually come from recognition. Not intellectual recognition, biological recognition. Because somewhere beneath modern schedules and screens and cities, human beings still carry ancient instincts formed long before civilization existed. Instincts shaped in worlds remarkably similar to the one Neanderthals inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years. And maybe that is why the image of the final Neanderthals feels so emotionally powerful once you truly imagine it clearly. Because somewhere in Europe, small groups of them continued surviving, while the world around them transformed beyond recognition. Perhaps still sitting beside fires at night telling stories beneath the stars, while modern human populations expanded across the same continent, carrying entirely different futures inside their minds. Imagine one of those final evenings. The fire burns low inside a cave darkened by winter wind. Children sleep beneath animal hides. Someone sharpens a stone tool beside the glowing embers. Outside the cold stretches endlessly across the valley. And somewhere far beyond the hills another human camp exists. A Homo sapiens camp filled with different tools, different social systems, different ways of understanding the world. Quietly expanding generation after generation toward the future that will eventually belong entirely to them. And neither group fully understands yet that they are living through one of the most important transitions in the history of life on Earth. Because after this moment there will only be one surviving human species left. One. For almost all of earlier human history, multiple human species existed at the same time across the planet. Different kinds of humans, different bodies, different adaptations, different cultures, different ways of surviving. And then eventually all of them vanished except us. The Neanderthals disappeared. The Denisovans disappeared. Homo erectus disappeared. Every other branch of humanity faded into extinction until only Homo sapiens remained standing alone. And perhaps we rarely stop to appreciate how strange that truly is, because today humanity feels singular and inevitable, as though our dominance over the planet was always guaranteed, but the prehistoric world tells a very different story, one where multiple human species once struggled beside each other against climate, predators, hunger, disease, and time itself. Which means our existence today was never inevitable. It could have gone differently, a slightly different climate pattern, a few harsher winters, a disease outbreak, a failed migration, and perhaps Homo sapiens might have disappeared instead while another human species inherited the Earth. That possibility alone changes the emotional meaning of human history completely, because suddenly civilization stops feeling like the predetermined destiny of the smartest species and starts feeling much more fragile, much more accidental, much more dependent on countless tiny events stacking together across thousands of years in ways nobody living through them could ever fully understand. And maybe this is ultimately why the extinction of the Neanderthals continues haunting modern imagination more than the extinction of almost any other species that has ever existed. Because when we look at them, we're looking into an alternate version of humanity itself, another intelligence staring back across deep time from the darkness of the Ice Age, close enough to recognize us, and yet distant enough to disappear forever. And the deeper scientists investigate their story, the less it resembles the simplistic image of brutish cavemen losing a battle against superior humans, and the more it begins resembling something profoundly tragic and complicated, a long, slow fading shaped by climate instability, shrinking populations, social differences, interbreeding, ecological pressure, and changing worlds moving faster than one human species could fully adapt to. And perhaps somewhere inside that tragedy, there is also a warning hidden for us now, because the Neanderthals remind us that survival is never permanent, no matter how intelligent, strong, or successful a species appears at its peak, since entire forms of humanity can vanish quietly while believing their world will continue forever. But at the same time, the Neanderthals also leave behind something strangely beautiful once you think about it long enough, because although their species disappeared, they were not erased completely from the story of humanity, since fragments of them still survive biologically inside billions of people alive today, while emotionally and psychologically they remain recognizable enough that modern humans can still feel grief, curiosity, empathy, and connection toward them tens of thousands of years after the last Neanderthal fire finally burned out beneath the Ice Age sky. And perhaps the most terrifying part of the Neanderthal story begins at the exact moment when they first realized they were no longer alone, because for hundreds of thousands of years Europe had belonged entirely to them. The frozen valleys, the forests, the caves glowing with firelight during endless winters, the migration paths of reindeer and mammoths, the rivers cutting through the Ice Age landscape, all of it woven so deeply into Neanderthal memory and survival that generation after generation moved through those environments with the kind of instinctive familiarity modern humans only feel when walking through cities they have known their entire lives. And then one day something changed, because somewhere beyond the horizon another kind of human entered that world. And if you stop and imagine that moment carefully enough, it becomes one of the strangest encounters in all of history. Because this was not the meeting between humans and animals, nor between civilization and nature, but between two intelligent human species standing face to face somewhere in the cold silence of prehistoric Europe, both capable of language, memory, fear, planning, social bonds, and emotional attachment, both carrying fire and tools and stories through the darkness, and perhaps for several long seconds neither side completely understood what they were looking at, because the newcomers looked human enough to trigger recognition immediately, while also appearing different enough to create deep instinctive uncertainty. Because Homo sapiens moved differently, looked different, sounded different, their bodies narrower and lighter, their social behavior perhaps more fluid and expressive, their tools unfamiliar, their voices carrying rhythms and patterns the Neanderthals had never heard before. And yet despite all those differences, they were still unmistakably human, close enough to resemble them and strange enough to disturb them at the same time, creating a psychological situation almost impossible for us to fully imagine now, because modern humans have never had to share the world with another intelligent human species before. And perhaps this is why the relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens remains so difficult to define even today, because the archaeological evidence suggests something extraordinarily complicated unfolded between them over thousands of years. Not a simple story of warfare and conquest, not peaceful coexistence either, but instead a shifting mixture of curiosity, fear, trade, observation, competition, avoidance, violence, and intimacy, happening again and again across Ice Age Europe, as both species move through the same territories, trying to survive in a world already harsh enough before another humanity appeared inside it. Because there were likely moments when Neanderthal groups noticed smoke rising from distant hillsides where no familiar band should have been camped, moments when hunters discovered strange footprints crossing old migration routes, moments when abandoned camps contained tools crafted in unfamiliar ways, moments when both species encountered each other suddenly beside rivers, carcasses, or cave entrances, and had to decide within seconds whether the being standing in front of them represented danger, opportunity, or something far more psychologically confusing than either of those things. And what makes this story even stranger is that despite all the tension and uncertainty surrounding these encounters, the genetic evidence now proves beyond doubt that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did not merely observe one another from a distance, because at some point relationships formed deeply enough for children to be born between them, meaning there were real moments in Ice Age Europe where a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens sat beside the same fire, shared food, touched each other, slept beside each other, protected one another, and created families together while perhaps never fully understanding how historically extraordinary those moments truly were. And once you fully absorb that reality, the emotional meaning of Neanderthal extinction changes completely, because their disappearance no longer feels like the loss of some distant unrelated species, but instead begins feeling strangely intimate, almost like the fading of forgotten relatives whose existence still echoes faintly beneath the surface of modern humanity itself, especially once you realize that billions of people alive today still carry Neanderthal DNA, inherited from those ancient encounters tens of thousands of years ago. And perhaps nowhere did the difference between these two human species matter more than in the structure of their societies, because although Neanderthals were physically powerful, highly intelligent survivors perfectly adapted to harsh Ice Age environments, Homo sapiens may have possessed something extraordinarily important that slowly transformed the balance between them over time, namely the ability to build massive, flexible social networks, connecting large numbers of people across enormous distances through trade, symbolic communication, shared myths, marriage alliances, and systems of cooperation capable of transferring information and resources between groups separated by hundreds of miles. And at first this difference may sound abstract compared to strength or intelligence, but inside prehistoric environments, social networks were survival itself, because small isolated populations are terrifyingly fragile over long periods of time, where a few deaths during winter, a few failed births, one disease outbreak, or several unsuccessful hunting seasons can push an already small community toward collapse, whereas larger interconnected Homo sapiens networks possessed resilience because resources, migration opportunities, survival knowledge, and even people themselves could move across those networks before local disasters became irreversible. Imagine, for example, a Neanderthal band losing several experienced hunters during a brutal winter, while food becomes scarce, and nearby groups are too distant or too fragmented to provide meaningful support before starvation begins spreading through the camp. And now compare that situation to expanding Homo sapiens populations connected through larger alliance systems where information, trade relationships, migration routes and extended social bonds linked many groups together across wide territories, creating survival systems capable of absorbing environmental shocks in ways isolated Neanderthal populations often could not. And perhaps this was the true evolutionary revolution that eventually changed the fate of humanity forever. Not simply sharper weapons or larger brains, but the emergence of a species capable of imagining itself as part of enormous invisible social realities, extending far beyond immediate family or local territory. Because once humans learned how to cooperate at that scale, the balance of survival itself may have shifted permanently. And what makes this possibility so haunting is that the Neanderthals themselves were not failures in any simple sense of the word, because they had already survived Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived, enduring brutal climates, dangerous predators, environmental instability, and physical hardships that would terrify most modern people, meaning they were already one of the most successful human species that had ever existed by prehistoric standards. But evolution can be cruel in ways that feel almost unfair, because the exact traits that allow a species to thrive for enormous stretches of time under one set of conditions can become dangerous liabilities. Once environments begin changing faster than those traits can adapt, and the Ice Age world surrounding both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was changing constantly through violent climate fluctuations transforming forests into grasslands, altering migration routes, disrupting ecosystems, and forcing human populations into repeated adaptation again and again. And while Neanderthals adapted repeatedly throughout their history, Homo sapiens may have possessed unusually high behavioral flexibility, allowing them to shift hunting methods, expand diets, create broader exchange systems, experiment with new technologies, move across different environments more rapidly, and maintain larger social alliances capable of sharing survival knowledge over vast distances, which slowly may have created an accumulating advantage difficult for fragmented Neanderthal populations to resist over thousands of years. And perhaps the saddest part of the entire extinction process is that it probably did not feel dramatic from the inside while it was happening, because extinction viewed historically appears enormous and inevitable, but extinction experienced personally often feels ordinary and gradual, like life simply becoming a little harder each generation, without anyone fully understanding that an irreversible collapse is unfolding across the larger world beyond their awareness. Imagine being a Neanderthal parent somewhere in Europe 38,000 years ago, waking beside the fire before dawn, while snow drifts silently outside the cave entrance, feeding your children, repairing tools, discussing where food might still be found, laughing briefly at some familiar story told many times before, all while completely unaware that your species may already be approaching its final generations historically, because from your perspective life still feels recognizably normal, despite the invisible pressures accumulating around you year after year. And that is perhaps what makes the disappearance of the Neanderthals feel so psychologically disturbing even now. because it reminds us that extinction does not always arrive through one giant catastrophic ending, dramatic enough for everyone to recognize immediately, but often emerges slowly through shrinking populations, environmental stress, declining resilience, disrupted social connections, and fewer children surviving each generation until eventually the chain connecting past and future breaks forever. And somewhere during that long fading process, there may have been Neanderthals watching Homo sapiens communities spreading across landscapes once occupied entirely by their own ancestors, seeing unfamiliar tools, broader trade networks, different social behavior, perhaps even sensing without fully understanding that another form of humanity was gradually inheriting the future, while their own world slowly narrowed around them year after year. And eventually, after thousands of years of coexistence, competition, adaptation, interbreeding, migration, and environmental change, only one human species remained standing beneath the Ice Age sky. Because the Neanderthals disappeared, the Denisovans disappeared, and every other branch of ancient humanity vanished, until Homo sapiens alone carried language, memory, imagination, grief, myth, and civilization forward into the future. And maybe the reason this story still haunts modern people so deeply is because when we study the Neanderthals long enough, the boundary separating them from us begins dissolving almost completely, until their extinction no longer feels like the disappearance of primitive strangers from a distant world, but instead starts feeling like the loss of another possible version of ourselves, another humanity close enough to recognize us, and fragile enough to vanish forever, while fragments of them remained hidden silently inside our own species all along. And perhaps the saddest part of the entire Neanderthal story is that the final years of their existence probably did not feel dramatic at all from the inside, because extinction rarely announces itself clearly while it is happening, meaning that somewhere across Ice Age Europe there were still Neanderthal families waking beside fires, feeding children, repairing tools, telling stories, and planning for futures they believed would continue normally, even while their species itself was quietly approaching its end generation after generation. And maybe that is what makes their disappearance feel so haunting even now, because there was likely no final battle, no single catastrophe, no moment where the last Neanderthals fully understood history was ending around them, but instead a slow fading caused by shrinking populations, environmental instability, isolation, competition, and a rapidly changing world becoming harder and harder to survive inside, until eventually there were simply fewer fires burning each winter beneath the Ice Age sky. And somewhere during those final centuries, Neanderthals may have watched Homo sapiens populations spreading across territories once occupied entirely by their own ancestors, seeing strangers carrying unfamiliar tools, broader social networks, different ways of surviving, perhaps sensing without fully understanding that another form of humanity was gradually inheriting the future, while their own world slowly grew quieter around them year after year. And eventually one final Neanderthal died somewhere on this planet without realizing they were the last of their kind, because extinction from the inside usually feels ordinary rather than historical. And after that moment the rivers continued flowing, the snow continued falling, the stars continued turning above the earth exactly as before, while Homo sapiens alone carried humanity forward into the future. But perhaps the strangest part of all is that the Neanderthals never truly disappeared completely, because fragments of them still survive inside billions of people alive today through ancient DNA inherited from encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago, meaning that even now small pieces of that lost humanity continue existing quietly inside the modern world. And maybe that is why the story of the Neanderthals still affects people so deeply, because when we look at them long enough, the line separating them from us begins disappearing until their extinction no longer feels like the loss of strange primitive creatures from a distant world, but instead like the fading of forgotten relatives who once sat beside fires under the same stars, wondered about survival and death, the same way we still do now, and then vanished while we remained. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is looking up at the night sky exactly the same way a Neanderthal child once did 40,000 years ago, while listening to the sound of fire crackling in the darkness, and perhaps that is the final thing their story leaves behind. The reminder that long before civilization, before cities, before history itself, there were already humans searching for warmth, meaning, safety and connection beneath the same ancient sky that still hangs above us tonight.